Hi there. Welcome to my website. Glad you looked over what's going on today with my new column and with other things I put up on the site. I was remiss by not writing about the anniversary of 9/11, 23 years ago when that terrible event took place. If you're a little older like me, you certainly remember exactly where you were when 9/11 happened. I had family involved in what happened, friends of what happened in 9/11. I want to tell you about it today. There's a great poem. W.H. Auden, the poet, back in 1946, wrote this line: I have watched through a window a world that has fallen apart. I have watched through a window a world that has fallen apart. That's pretty much what we saw during 9/11. Uh, I woke up. I don't know where you were if you remember it, but if you did, it was an unbelievable story. It was like the Kennedy assassination, where you were glued to the TV over this terrible event when two planes hit the World Trade Center. I was at my home having breakfast when a good friend of the family calls, says, Jim, turn on your TV immediately. You're not going to believe what's happened. A plane has hit the World Trade Center. Oh my gosh, some pilot lost control. There was some accident. So I turned on the TV. You saw the smoke. You saw uh, the aftermath of one plane that hit the World Trade Center. What an accident. What a terrible event. And I sat there watching, and all of a sudden, someone started screaming on the TV, another plane. And you saw this massive jet come in and hit the World Trade Center. And of course, both towers, the Twin Towers in New York, that I've been in and had meals there in the Twin Towers, all were up in smoke. Hadn't collapsed yet, but all up in smoke. Well, I immediately called my four children to be sure they were paying attention. This was going to be such a mesmerizing event, such a historic event, such a terrible event. And I got three of my kids, and they were two of them were watching. One went to the TV and watched. I couldn't get the fourth child. Fourth child was in Washington, D.C. I thought, I just wasn't sure. My oldest daughter, Campbell, who at the time was working for NBC News, she's the White House correspondent for NBC News. She had traveled the day before on a plane with Nancy Reagan. They retired a former uh, Air Force One, the president's plane. And she was the only person allowed to fly back with Nancy Reagan, going from the plane, I believe it was in Washington, D.C., to California. And then she came back. I didn't know she was coming back that day, the day of 9/11, or maybe the night before. Well, I couldn't get her on her cell phone. I called the White House where her office was, and there was no answer. The White House didn't even ring, it just went dead. There was nothing at the White House telephone. That got me worried. And so then, as I'm watching the television set, they were talking about a third and fourth plane in the air. And the opinion was one was going to be headed towards Washington, D.C., to either hit the White House or hit Congress. And so that obviously got me very worried. And then it was a little later on that day when I finally made contact with her. She told me that she was at her desk. She'd come back from California at her desk in the White House. A Secret Service had kicked her shoes off for comfort at her desk, and the Secret Service agent said, come immediately, drop everything right out of the White House. She grabbed her heels and grabbed her computer, and out the door she ran as they evacuated the White House, thinking another plane was heading towards Washington, D.C., and heading towards the White House. Well, then she went across the street to the Willard Hotel, a historic hotel, Abraham Lincoln. Spent time at the Willard Hotel. I can tell you some great stories about the Willard. She made it to the Willard right across the street. But around the Willard, they had blocked off everything. You couldn't come in or come out. And she spent 3 days at the Willard Hotel broadcasting to NBC News about what was going on with this terrible event. So then the towers collapsed. And it just was unimaginable that these massive towers with steel structures could basically just disintegrate and crash down with an awful lot of people, and they're dying. And you saw the terrible pictures of people jumping out windows so they wouldn't get burned. They'd rather die jumping and crashing on the cement. You saw pictures of police officers and firefighters. They're trying to get people out and contain some of the fire. And then every now and then you'd hear a thud. It was someone who jumped down and hitting on the outside of the World Trade Center. What just a terrible, terrible event. Well, I stayed there and listened, and then several things came to mind. The next day, I called my good friend Neil Levin. He was the insurance commissioner in New York for a good while. We became very good friends, went to England together to examine Lloyd's of London. And Neil and I had talked maybe a week before, and he said, "Come on up to New York. I'm now running the World Trade Center as part of all of the ports of New York and New Jersey, the Port Authority." He ran the Port Authority. His office was in the World Trade Center. I called, but it was obvious that Neil did not get out. We finally found that, talked to his wife weeks later, and she said they never recovered his body. He'd just been vaporized when the second plane hit the Twin Tower. So I lost my good friend, Neil Levin. Another good friend who was a lawyer in New York, Kevin Salters, his name. His office was right across the street from the World Trade Center. Well, when the first plane hit, he told everyone, "Evacuate, get out." And he lingered a bit, got his files, put them in his briefcase, and got down and started walking up one of the main avenues, I think Fifth Avenue, from the World Trade Center. Well, when the second plane hit, he ran like everybody else did, but he said a massive wall of soot just came and engulfed him. You could not see your fingers if you put them up to your eyes. In fact, if you did, you'd get the soot in your eyes. So he reached down and saw the curb and kind of took a chance on which direction to head and started crawling along the curb uptown. Made it about a block. Then he saw a very thin light, went up to a doorway and knocked, and someone had opened the door for him, and he came in and got out into a building that was standing, was able to wash himself off in the restroom there, just covered with soot. And then after it had calmed down, he walked up to 42nd Street, walked for several hours up 42nd Street to get away from all of the soot and the dust and all the terrible things that were happening there. Something else I want to read to you. I've written about this in several books. This is called the Jim Brown Reader, kind of a compilation of many of the things I've written. What I thought was interesting was why this happened in the first place. There's a column, a fellow named James Gill, passed away, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and he wrote this the next day after the World Trade Center. He said, "But the FBI is supposed to keep tabs on terrorists. If they can be caught entirely unawares by a foreign plot that obviously required meticulous planning and constant radio and telephone contact, then we are entitled to ask, what are they good for? The FBI has been more or less a laughing stock in years." That was a comment by very respected reporter of the Times-Picayune, James Gill. So there were a lot of questions asked. The pilots took a basic lesson on how to land the plane, weren't concerned about taking off on the plane, bought a one-way ticket with cash. And there's all kinds of signs that this should not have happened, these folks. And we're seeing this today. We're seeing this last week where potential terrorists of former President Donald Trump for 9-10 hours with the rifles on the golf course overlooking the course to try to find Trump. And you wonder where the security is. It's a whole different world out there today. And I'm writing about that now, about security in schools. Uvalde, Texas, what a horrible thing that happened, the lack of security in Uvalde, Texas. And I'll get on that later on in a future column. Hey, glad you spent some time. I wanted to remember 9/11. It's something we shouldn't forget. Every year on the anniversary, we should think about it and reflect on it, look back over what it coulda, shoulda, woulda, the comments that we look back to learn so that these events don't happen in the future. Glad you're looking over my website this week. Hope you enjoy my columns, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.